Aquinas' best-known argumentations for God's existence can be found in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3, where he presents in a relatively brief form 5 proofs of God's existence. It should be mentioned that versions of these proofs are present in a number of Aquinas' other works, and that the proofs presented here in the Summa Theologica tend to be briefer than the more extended discussions in other works. They can thus be considered outlines of demonstrations that contain metaphysical principles that are implicit or justified in other works. In each of these proofs, Aquinas follows the structure of a demonstration quia. That is, he begins with knowledge of certain effects of God, and through reasoning from effect to cause, concludes that God exists. The first proof that Aquinas presents, and the one he considers the clearest, is the one that begins with things that are moved, and from movement reasons to the cause of movement. This lesson will focus on the first of Aquinas' 5 ways. To begin the study of Aquinas' first proof, it would be best to first read it through. After first reading, we will then go through the argument step by step. As we read this proof, keep in mind that although it may be difficult to follow Aquinas through the technical aspects of his demonstration, he is trying to present a rigorous rational argumentation that begins with certain and evident principles, and, following demonstrative reasoning, results in a conclusion that can be held with certainty. The goal of this first reading is to simply follow Aquinas' argumentation and get a sense of its general structure. The first and clearest way is that taken from movement or change. It is certain and obvious to the senses that in this world some things are moved. But everything that is moved by another. For nothing is moved except insofar as it is in potentiality with respect to that actuality toward which it is moved, whereas something affects movement insofar as it is in actuality in a relevant respect. After all, to affect movement is just to lead something from potentiality into actuality. But a thing cannot be led from potentiality to actuality except through some being that is in actuality in a relevant respect. For example, something that is hot in actuality, say a fire, makes a piece of wood which is hot in potentiality to be hot in actuality, and it thereby moves and alters the piece of wood. But it is impossible for something to be simultaneously in potentiality and in actuality with respect to the same thing. Rather, it can be in potentiality and in actuality only with respect to different things. For what is hot in actuality cannot simultaneously be hot in potentiality. Rather, it is cold in potentiality. Therefore, it is impossible that something should be both mover and moved in the same way and with respect to the same thing, or in other words, that something should move itself. Therefore, everything that is moved must be moved by another. If then that by which something is moved is itself moved, then it too must be moved by another, and that other by still another. But this does not go on to infinity. For if it did, then there would not be any first mover, and as a result, none of the others would affect movement either. For secondary movements affect movement only because they are being moved by a first mover, just as a stick does not affect movement except because it is being moved by a hand. Therefore, one has to arrive at some first mover that is not being moved by anything. And this is what everyone takes to be a god. To summarize, Thomas Aquinas' first way has a structure. First of all, it begins with a point of departure which is evident to us, namely movement. The argument then reasons to a conclusion using two important propositions. First of all, that whatever is moved by another. And second of all, that the series of moved movers cannot go on infinitely. The conclusion is that there must be a first unmoved mover, which we call God. In this video, and in the next few videos, we will make a more detailed study of the different parts of Aquinas' first proof of the existence of God. In the second part of this present video, we will take a deeper look at Aquinas' point of departure for this first proof, and in so doing, we will get a taste for the terminology that he uses. In the next two videos, video 7.1 and video 7.2, we will examine the metaphysical propositions that underpin this proof. Finally, in video 8, we will go over the conclusion that Aquinas arrives at for this first proof. Aquinas begins his first proof with things that are changed, or to use a more technical language, things that are moved, motus in Latin. For Aquinas, it is obvious to the senses and certain that in the world some things are moved. One thing to take special notice of here is that Aquinas wants to start his demonstration of God's existence with something that is immediately evident to us and therefore certain. So he begins with something we can sense immediately in the world, the truth of which is evident immediately to us, and therefore requires no demonstration, namely, that there are beings that are moved, or moved beings. To better understand the terminology used in this proof, we can recall what movement is. As we saw in the previous lesson, something changes or moves when it passes from being in potency in some way to being act in that way. For example, a wall that is not yet blue, but which can be blue, is said to be blue in potency. The wall becomes actually blue through change or movement. And thus we can say that the wall was changed from being non-blue to blue. Or to put it more technically, the wall was moved from being potentially blue to being blue. Here we see that the wall is what is moved, the motum, and this is the starting point of Thomas Aquinas' first way, that there are things that are moved.